Welcome to the Creative Community. I'm your host, David Starkey, and my guest this time is Aldon Nielsen, poet, writer, scholar, musician. We could go on and on. But
husband of Anna Everett.
That's right, husband of Anna Everett. And we're going to talk a lot about poetry. You've just retired from a long career in Pennsylvania. Can you talk about that for a sec?
Yeah, well, I was for 22 years Santa Barbarans. I've been commuting between here and Little State College, Pennsylvania. Right. Before that, I was commuting down to LA at Loyola Marymount. Before that, I was commuting back and forth to San Jose State. So, I've been in motion most of my professional life.
But you've had a home here in town for a long time.
More than 20 years. I
Yeah.
can't remember. Yeah, we've been in our current house. So it must have been a quarter century that we've been living in Santa Barbara.
Wow. Yeah. So what's that like to be retired after all this time of coming and going, and now you're plunked down here?
Well, part of what it's like is finally getting to know this place.
Right.
In some ways, I didn't really live anywhere. I used to tell people I lived at Dulles Airport. It was almost true.
Right.
So I've been in Santa Barbara, but not of it. I've been in and out. So this will be an opportunity for me to, well, partly to get to hear more of the local poets, which I never had much chance to do before, but also just generally get more sense of the culture of this community.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I'm glad to welcome you on this show.
Thank you.
I know you have a ton of experience and poetry to offer us. You have an autobiography, and you have a really interesting kind of story getting from where you started to where you are now. Could you give us kind of the thumbnail sketch? Thumbnail sketch of that.
Well, it's not a full-on autobiography. What it is the poet E. Ethelbert Miller in Washington, D.C. Asked if he could do an online interview with me.
Right.
And that grew into this book called Memoirs.
Yeah.
And
Great
well,
title, yeah.
except that there are two other books with the same title. Yeah, anyway, you can't copyright titles, folks. That's why if I ever have a collected poems, it will be called Leaves of Grass, I think. But at any rate, so he asked me questions about, some would be obvious, like poetry and place,
Right.
and poetry and this, that, and the other, technology and so forth. But it was a chance for me to sort of look back at the odd itinerary of my life starting out like Governor Walls in a very small town in Nebraska, bigger than his though.
Okay.
In fact, I think his town is down to 440 people or something like that.
And what was your town?
I was born in Grand Island, which at the time probably had 32,000.
Okay.
We left just before a tornado took out about a third of the town.
Oh, wow.
But we were farm people. My parents had grown up in a little Ansley, Nebraska, which I know is down to 400 people now. It was maybe 700 when they were there.
Wow.
Yeah. But anyway, we moved to skip to Denver briefly, and then to the Washington, D.C. area, which is where I really came of age.
Right.
And culturally, it was the most magnificent place I could have been in because every weekend there was free music in a park somewhere. Because of the Library of Congress and the Folger Shakespeare Library and the public libraries, there were poetry readings every week, and most of them were free. And so, I was really...
You got your education there.
Yeah, in addition to the school. I'm a proud graduate of the University of the District of Columbia, and then I got my doctorate at George Washington. But yeah, there was poetry and fiction everywhere, and I got to attend things like the Penn Faulkner Awards for the best novel of the year.
Right.
Free.
Right. You just wandered down the street.
Well, that invitation came about for a brief time before I left town. I was actually on the advisory board to the D.C. Commission on the Arts and Humanities, which is the way they collect from you after they've given you a couple of grants. I bought my first computer with a grant from the Arts and Humanities Commission. But no, it was just really, really vibrant. And then when I came to California, we were in San Jose, and there was the whole Bay Area poetry scene to be involved with there. Poetry Flash would give you a guide, and I was doing the radio show then. So I would go around the Bay Area recording, I don't know, a bookstore reading that only had 15 people in the audience, but I would broadcast it to 50,000 people. Right. And it was on twice a week. And then, of course, we moved to LA briefly, and you know what that's like. Right. So until I decided to spend 22 years in Little State College, Pennsylvania, I was deeply immersed in poetry communities, but there are only 40,000 people in that town. So.
Well, talk to me a little bit. There's a lot of different types of poetry,
right.
as you know better than anybody. Yeah. Who were the poets that were influencing the sort of poetry that you ended up writing?
In that autobiographical interview book, I mentioned the two earliest really I mean, I was reading, Carl Sandburg and stuff
Sure.
in grade school, but the two immediate influences that have never left me were Bob Dylan and Amiri Baraka, which I encountered both around the same time. My sister had one of the folk albums. I don't know if I'd ever listened to it, but sitting in the backseat of my parents' car when Like a Rolling Stone came on, I heard it. And I thought, you can write poetry and have it be pop music,
Right.
Now, Chuck Berry was already doing that,
Sure,
but nobody was doing it like the kind of surrealism that Dylan was doing. And around the same time, we had the Brentano's bookstores everywhere when I was a teenager. And I saw the cover of The Dead Lecture by Leroy Jones, as he then styled himself, and took that home. And my itinerary is a little different from a lot of my friends. They tended to find people like Baraka through the so-called New American poetry, Olson and Creeley and so on.
Right.
For me, it was the
Those are
opposite.
famous anthologies.
Yeah, for me, it was the opposite. I was reading Baraka. There's a poem for C.O. I said, well, who's C.O.? And of course, it turned out to be Olson. Or a poem called Duncan Spoke of a Process. I said, well, who's Duncan? And I discovered,
Robert.
yeah, exactly, Robert Duncan. And so eventually, same thing with my interest in jazz. I would read the liner notes of the album.
And then you go find out who
exactly.
who
Go
was-
listen to
yeah,
music
right.
by all those people who played
Right,
on that
right.
album. Same thing with the
Right.
literature. So it was never systematic. I never had any college course that took me through this.
But I think you have a pretty established aesthetic.
Yeah.
It turned out to be something, right?
Yeah, it's kind of an outgrowth of that New American poetry era. Shirley Gooklin Lim here once asked me if I was a language poet. I said, well, I'm kind of a friend of language poets.
Right.
Whatever a language poet may be.
Right.
Yeah.
And how, for our viewers who don't know what language poetry is, how would you summarize that?
It was an informal movement that it was called that as an insult by one of my
yeah.
colleagues at San Jose State. But there were a group of poets that created their own venues and were particularly interested in questions of linguistics. And eventually they began reading more and more philosophy and theory. If you go back and look at the issues of their magazine, which is called Language, you'll see they would print these bibliographies where people would say, you should read this book, you should read this book. They came to, in the early years, they were attacked viciously by all the establishment figures and criticism and so on. But interestingly enough, over the years, they came to be recognized, and Ray Armantrout won a Pulitzer Prize.
Charles Bernstein taught at the University of Pennsylvania?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So they made their mark, for sure.
Although there's a myth that they took over the academy, which is BS. Hardly any of them are professors anywhere.
Let's hear, we're talking about poetry, let's hear a poem by you, just so we can kind of get a sense of, what you were
In my
up
most
to.
recent books, I've done a series of poems that have to do with the music of my youth. This one's called The Way We Listened Then, and it's about how we listened to music back in my teenage years. There's an epigraph from Jimi Hendrix, look at the sky, turn a hellfire red. Only one would have had the new one. And so it was a house music, a house afire we gathered in, wreathed in the smoke of the new. Blue rings around blue sounds, gatefold lapped in admiration or spindly singular splendor stacked changer. Taped coins wait conducting tone arm, glide path through grooves on transcription table. Rave up affair bespoke one head wore phones, restless speakers roused the rest. That slow drag in a far corner to stay in my corner, giving way to medicated goo, the Who, or Miles's latest brew. A difference engine tuned my generation in bloom, cones shaking the firmament from our father's house. James and Jimmy and their flames trained our ears towards sun-raw spheres, miles in the sky, our eyes apprised. Raised on rhythms, we were the ones who knew we knew, for hearing the ones who knew more.
A lot of rhyme in that poem.
Yeah, well, again, there's a few references anyone younger than us might not get. For example,
I think I got all of them.
well,
so
the one about the coins on the tone.
right.
You
Because
know,
sometimes your record would look like
so
that.
you would
right?
tape a bunch of quarters to that
yeah.
tone arm to make it stay in the groove. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking too, now we have Spotify and Apple
Right.
Music and you can listen to anything at any time. But even then, you're talking about everybody gathering around the
Exactly.
record player for the person who bought the record.
Right.
And I can remember, I'm a little bit younger than you, that the next stage was to borrow somebody's records and make a cassette copy of it, right?
And then you would exchange those
And then you would,
mixtapes.
and you would give some records to the person in turn, and that it would kind of creep out that way.
Yes.
But there's always been a way to listen to music that's not on the radio, and it's friend to friend. That's a kind of, that was the old version of file sharing, I guess.
Well, and the other thing is you would tell each other about stuff you heard on air. And believe it or not, radio was more various then than it
sure
has
was,
become.
yeah.
And so there were, most towns that had FM stations would have a jazz show, for example.
Right.
In my later teens and early 20s, Howard University started their own radio station, WHUR. And when they first came on, their slogan was 360 degrees of black music, and that was true. However, over time it got down to about 20 degrees, and the so-called quiet storm format took over. And radio stations today are just so formatted, and run by computers that if you don't go out online and look for streaming materials, you just won't.
Well, and even if you do go, your algorithm is going to be shoving you in a direction you may not necessarily want to go.
But that's where your friends come in. You hear about musicians that you would never know if someone didn't tell you about.
Right.
Or even the regular news media. My wife and I went down to Hollywood Bowl. The headliners were Willie Nelson, John Mellencamp, and Bob Dylan. But the opening act was Brittany Spencer, who I'd only heard about in a newspaper. And she just put out her first album. And I probably wouldn't have heard about her at all, except Beyonce's country album attracted so much media attention to the idea of black people in country, which shocked them apparently. So she was one of the black artists doing country music who sort of caught that wave, which is still building up. So you just have to have your ears open, and it'll come.
Well, I'm curious too. I mean, the poem you just read was about listening to music, but how else has music affected your writing of poetry?
Well, again, I don't write stanzaic metered verse usually. When I do, it's usually a satire of some sort. And yet, that old line of Pounds, as disreputable as that man is, the old line of Pound and the younger poet Zhukovsky about following the line of music along the, how do you put it? Following the rhythm along the line of music or something like that. Okay. And so you might not have the same rhythm as in that poem in every stanza, but you're very much attentive to the rhythms. This is sort of the 20th century mode of changing from meter to rhythm, quote unquote. And similarly, the sonic effects of the words themselves. You don't necessarily rhyme, but although most popular music still does, although not very well, I've noticed. But you're still very attentive. Well, I'm saying you. I am still very attentive to the relationships among the sounds. And again, having taken linguistics courses, I kind of think about that sort of thing anyway. And having traveled around the world a tiny bit, I'm always listening to the music. For example, I've been watching some Irish shows on TV, and you've heard the Irish. That intonation pattern is so different from most Americans, and very musical. So I'm always thinking about these things while I'm selecting the words that will get to what I'm trying to get.
I mean, are you conscious of that? Very conscious of that.
Yeah, all the time. Yeah. Well, not all the time. Every once in a while, I just write something that I just dash off.
I find when I'm writing that I have, there's some internal rhythm that's going on, and once I start to follow it, I don't want to think about it too much because I'm afraid I'm going to screw it up.
Well, when I was younger, it was literally the rhythm of walking. I walked all across downtown DC to go to school.
Right.
And a line would pop into my head as I was going, and by the time I got to school, I probably had a couple of stanzas, and it was all, exactly in my head. I can't do that anymore because I just don't walk that much anymore.
Right. Well, let's hear another poem, Aldon.
Okay, I'll do another one kind of in the same vein, and then maybe we'll turn to a couple of poems about teachers I worked with. This one, I always have to tell people that literally none of my poetry is autobiographical. Unless my wife's name is explicitly mentioned, it's probably fiction.
There's no Anna it's not autobiographical.
Exactly. And this one, going back to the music of that era, this is called A First Hearing Sounds Orchestral. Play Vince Guaraldi's Cast Your Fate to the Wind on a car radio. Now, Vince Guaraldi's probably best known to the audience for writing the soundtrack to some Peanuts TV shows, right? But Cast Your Fate to the Wind was a huge show. Now, of course, at the time this takes place, I didn't have a driver's license. I wasn't old enough to drive. Right. None of this happened. Anyway. Blaze of night phrase, moon in blue phase, faith cast on waters. Rivers saying sandpipers, Orphic impressions shake poor hearts too. My best friend sky knocking clear channel running alongside. The cast into wind past Haynes Point claims our fates. We unwrapped ourselves for this. Limbs parting in the winds of unthreaded music, We were winded, sated in waves, minded to repeat ourselves, to heat up with steamed window against night beats streaming. Dawn rose with river song from film unsung, unstrung. We were singular, spun again, cast to the wind. Now, the thing Santa Barbara readers won't know is Haynes Point, where that poem takes place, was a notorious parking spot for young folks.
For young lovers.
And of course, you had to play music while you were there.
Yeah, I mean, when I listen to you read aloud, I think, wow, this is a poet with a great ear. Before you launch a poem into the world, do you read it out loud multiple times? Do you ever read it as you're writing?
Just in my head.
In your head?
Yeah.
You wouldn't necessarily say, okay, I got to read this before I...
No, in fact, I think my wife and the previous girlfriends that I don't speak of were always kind of surprised to find these things laying around because they didn't see me do it. I used to do it a lot on my night shift job, for example. Okay. And I never really did readings at the beginning. I was very naive. I thought if you appeared in public, people would try to find you. How wrong I was. And in fact, I didn't even...
Yeah, you were barking up the wrong tree.
I didn't even use my full name on the poems that I published. Right. And while I was still an undergrad, I had a lot of friends in theater arts, and I would have them go be me at a poetry reading.
They would be
me, yeah. Partly because I had that night shift I was working. But, you know, my first reading turned out to be at the Folger Shakespeare Library.
Oh, wow.
Which sounds pretty hot, except they were under reconstruction. And every time I opened my mouth, the jackhammer started up. And I got paid for it.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
So what other things, I mean, I want to hear some more poetry, but what else is like on your mind these days? What do you...
Well, like everybody, I've got politics on my mind
right.
now. I don't write very many overtly political poems, but I do write a lot of poems about race and history and so on. The one time I was overt, although it might not seem that way to people reading the poem, in 2016, well, following the 2016 election, a lot of poets put together this mammoth anthology. It's a resistance anthology, essentially.
Right, I kind of remember this, yeah.
And I had a poem there called Leaving Trump, which was based on this old blues song, Leaving Trunk. I taught that book to my grad students in China who were amazed that it wasn't banned. And one of my grad students actually figured out that connection to that old blues song, you know, all on his own without any hints from me or anything. And I was just, there's some good students.
Yeah. And that's something that you've done more than once, right? Teaching in China?
Yeah, well, I haven't done it since the pandemic. I was in fact teaching in Wuhan, which is where the pandemic got started. But for 8 summers, I would spend a month or two teaching in China. It's essentially become a second home to me. And Anna went over once and gave some lectures while she was there. It was just a wonderful experience. You may know Governor Walsup early in his life taught there a little bit, high school level, and then took students over there on study abroad programs, and now the resistance to Harris Walz are trying to suggest that the Chinese were grooming him to be a spy. Right. They haven't found me and accused me.
Well, I've been over to Japan for 8 times, and my son lives over there. I don't know if you feel spending a lot of time in another country, especially one with a rich poetic tradition, has affected your own poetry.
Oh, yeah, very much. Again, I was never a quote-unquote poet of place the way Ed Olson was, but a trip to Ghana resulted in a poetic sequence that is in one of my books, and there's a whole sequence, I think it's just called From China. And partly just walking around, the things you would hear, the things you would see, just being in any new place kind of springs a bout of writing.
I think it
usually,
does, We just have about 8.5 minutes left. I want to hear at least one more poem, maybe 2.
I don't know if it's odd to write about your own teachers. I'm trying to encourage my students to think they should do it. This first one is about Amiri Baraka. It's simply called In a Class with Baraka, and this dates back to the 1970s. In the end, then, to a room, half hangs outside, the hall trashed and overheated. Ashes add up under chairs, motes streaming, blinking lids, an odor of investment accrues to this room. English beats against the glass, shadowing through the panes upon the table, obstructing paths of passing planes. The capital's accumulation of images in the mute wavering grain is something we dissect, practicing between ourselves the removal of harmful forms. Head at the window, scarring the glass, meaning glazes over the watching White House. beating back American artist in residence in the new Department of Corrections, planes the blades of our speech, asks examples. Mine is of a piece with a room at an end that hangs outside in essential popular air. Mine is of a flight that exclaims. Fingers against the glass, I check my watch, prepare to give examples. And if we have time for just one more.
No, we have time for...
The only creative writing class I took in my life, I took with Gil Scott-Heron, who of course is best known as the author of The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, a recording artist and so on. Most people don't even know he did teach. And this was at what was then Federal City College, became the University District of Columbia. And there's one of those cases, he had to quit teaching because the records were selling too well. He had to go out on tour with the band. Anyway, this is called All the Places We've Been, a prayer for Gil Scott-Heron. Take me to the pilot played on the radio, but we didn't know you in our first class. Gloves out at fingertips, braids beneath leather cap, busied yourself, then busied us. Busy as you were, the Fender Rhodes Scholar of Bluesology was to be our pilot whom the cap fit. That first minute of that winter day when nobody knew what to say, we were to be writers on the storm. Time was right up on us. Time was tight. The now that was more than ever was what brought us together. Federal cities, ungranted land housed our unmitigated band. We were the unruled, unruly. We thought we'd call it morning. That storm music, no small talk at 2nd and E. Did you hear what they said back home? A toast to the people, ain't no new thing. From South Africa to South Carolina, we wrote, and writing rose within our souls. We could not know, watching your hands spider across the keys, how you were to end. How drift away was to be the closing number. Precious Lord, take his hand. Now that one has a lot of his own song titles flowing through it.
Yeah, there's a lot of allusions in that one, yeah.
Well, at the very end, the last couplet is actually one of the first gospel songs. Thomas A. Dorsey, who he used to play piano for people like I'm forgetting the names, the old blues styles of the 20s and 30s.
Mm-hmm.
Ma Rainey, that's what I was trying to think of. But then after the loss of his wife, he took to writing religious music, and that Precious Lord was one of the first ones he wrote. And to this day, people perform that song in churches. It was very controversial music at the beginning. People thought he was bringing the devil's music, the blues, into the church. And that's never quite entirely gone away.
Yeah. Well, it worked out on balance.
Yeah.
We haven't talked much about teaching. I mean, when you, during your long, varied teaching career, what were some of the main things that you wanted to get across to students, whatever the class was?
Well, my primary goal was introducing students to works that they would not otherwise find. Even when dealing with canonical people, for example, if I was going to teach Mark Twain, I wouldn't teach Huck Finn, I would teach, Pudhead Wilson, for example. Or for Nathaniel Hawthorne, I wouldn't teach The Scarlet Letter, I'd teach The House of the Seven Gables. Now, partly this was because in my day, everyone who graduated from high school had read Huck Finn, and
Right.
That's not so true anymore.
Right.
And in fact, it's probably banned in Florida by this time. So that was one of my goals. The other thing was simply to raise the critical abilities of my students so they could grapple with the things in our society. I always taught, in fact, my first tenure track job was in ethnic studies and literature at San Jose State. And there you were always trying to, well, again, this kind of thing is probably banned in at least 8 states these days, But we were trying to make sure that all of our students, and San Jose is, of course, a very multi-ethnic, multicultural place, but making sure that all of them recognize the deep traditions of these literatures. And that remains important to me. But like I said, as many professors do, I would also teach an occasional course based on whatever book I was trying to write at the time.
Right. But I was chuckling there when you're talking about the banning of these teaching, but it's actually true that you're not supposed to teach the historical context in which something occurred because it might hurt somebody's
Well, that's
feelings.
what's so bizarre about these new laws. They're so vague. You can be sued or fired for teaching something that might make somebody in the class uncomfortable based on their race. Well, nobody cared about this when black kids were reading Huck Finn in high school, And the way these laws are being employed now, it's very clear that the purpose is to suppress certain kinds of thinking. I've taught the literature of slavery my whole life, especially slave narratives. And my question would be, well, why would any white student feel bad in their own whiteness because slavery happened back then? In fact, they'll tell you in a minute they had nothing to do with it.
There you go.
And yet these laws are there for the precise purpose of keeping us from teaching these materials in a serious way, at least. The other day on Facebook, I made some comment about, there's this devious breed of historians out there whose argument is that slavery was some bad thing that just kind of happened to us and doesn't really have any effect anymore.
Right. Yeah. Happened like a weed growing.
Exactly.
Like
exactly.
That,
Wasn't us.
We just have about a minute and a half left, and I always like to have the guests give advice to people who are aspiring to work in that field. Do you have 45 seconds worth of advice for aspiring poets?
What I used to tell my students is that I'm a horrible example.
Okay.
I write very slowly, but over time, this is the good part of the advice, over time, it adds up. So even if you're a slow writer as I am, you get to the end of your life and there's this whole library of things you've published, which is kind of a nice feeling. But I also tell them in both my personal and professional lives, because as I mentioned, I've been commuting the whole time I've been married. And I came from a no-name school, University District of Columbia. Most of my colleagues were from the Ivy Leagues and so on. And so I would insist to my students that both in my personal life, my marriage, and in my professional life, I'm evidence that you can do it this way. You might try to do it some other way if you can, but you don't have to have been to Harvard to be successful as a professor of literature. You don't have to have like the ultimate job to feel good about yourself and so on. And I've taught at every kind of school there is, except the Ivy Leagues. They don't seem to recognize my charms. They
missed their chance.
But yeah, I started teaching it at HBCU. I've taught at two gargantuan state schools, and one of which is a Research One school. I've taught at Loyola Marymount, which is a small liberal arts Catholic school. You'll find this interesting. I got turned down when I applied for a job at the same community college where Jill Biden has been teaching.
Well, I'm going to have to stop us there, and I'm going to say thank you so much, Aldon Nielsen, for being on the show. Really appreciate your
and thanks to all the staff here, too. Yeah.
The Creative Community is a co-production of TVSB in Santa Barbara and CAPS Media in Ventura. I'm your host, David Starkey, and we'll see you next time.